Vladimir Ilyich Lenin looks into the camera as if it has asked the wrong question. In the famous close portrait, the lamp catches the smooth dome of his head, the beard trimmed like a line drawn with a ruler, the lips pressed thin from habit. His eyes do the unsettling work, pale, tired, and sharply attentive, as though he's listening to someone just outside the frame while the shutter clicks. In the winter of 1924, Moscow grieves on command, and the sound of it fills the streets like wind. Bands play slow marches, boots scrape packed snow, and every wall seems to grow a new portrait overnight. But behind the official black ribbons, the city is full of smaller noises that are not meant to be heard. A match struck too many times, a kettle left to boil dry, the faint rip of an envelope being opened and resealed. The air carries coal smoke and something sharper, paper smoke, like a secret trying to become a smell. In an apartment where the curtains never fully open, Nadezhda Krupskaya stands close to a cast-iron stove that breathes heat in short, measured gusts. She does not collapse into theatrics. She moves with the disciplined calm of someone who has spent her life turning feeling into duty. A bundle of letters rests on the table, tied with string, the paper thin in places, foreign in texture, handled so often the folds have become permanent. She loosens the knot, takes the first page, smooths it once with her thumb, an almost tender gesture, and feeds it to the flame. Outside her door, the building keeps its own kind of silence. Footsteps come, pause, and retreat down the stairwell as if the corridor itself has learned politeness. No one pounds or shouts. There is only the soft, deliberate waiting of people who believe they have time and, therefore, power. The stove answers with its own language, a dry crackle, a brief flare, then the steady glow as ink blackens and curls into nothing. Krupskaya watches closely, as if she expects the fire to hesitate on a particular sentence, as if one line might resist being erased. Each page burns differently. Some go fast, like they've been waiting for release. Others cling to their words until the last possible second, edges turning to fragile lace. The room fills with a thin haze that catches the light and makes her face look carved from tired marble. On the windowsill sits a stack of condolence telegrams, heavy paper, official phrasing, grief rendered into correct, safe formulas. On the table beside the string, there is a faint ring where a cup once sweated onto the wood, a small domestic mark that feels almost obscene in the presence of history being edited. The city will soon build a monument, polished and permanent, and call it truth. Yet here, truth is a thing that can be carried in two hands, tied with string, and destroyed in minutes. Krupskaya's expression barely changes, but her fingers betray her. A pause before one page, a tremor that vanishes when she clenches her jaw, a breath held too long. She is not burning gossip. She is burning leverage. She is burning the kind of tenderness that, in the wrong mouth, becomes a weapon sharper than any pamphlet. And somewhere beyond this apartment, at the press tables, in the corridors where translators smooth rough questions into respectful language, people are already asking about a woman the briefings refuse to name. A Frenchwoman, they whisper, as if the foreignness makes the danger easier to swallow. Krupskaya closes the stove door and listens to the fire settle, to the last brittle pops of paper surrendering. Outside, Moscow's morning swells like a choir. Inside, the smoke thins, but it does not disappear. It simply learns to travel. The morning after the burning, Moscow's papers carried the same clean sentences as if grief had been edited by committee. The foreign correspondents read them with polite faces and hungry eyes, then turned to the young translator assigned to their table. His job was to smooth rough Russian into comfortable French and English, to make questions sound respectful and answers sound final. Yet the questions kept snagging on a single thread. "The Frenchwoman," one reporter said softly, as if the word itself could be confiscated. Another leaned in, cigarette trembling. Armand. Was she at the bedside or not? At the official briefings, her name did not exist. Speakers praised discipline, health, sacrifice, the triumph of the collective over the private. When a hand rose from the press row and asked about Inessa Armand, the man at the podium blinked once, then smiled in a way that did not reach his cheeks. The translator waited for a denial, a correction, anything. Instead came a smooth detour into statistics and slogans, an answer that answered nothing. Afterward, the translator noticed the stenographer's page, a thin line drawn through the question, not crossed out in anger, but erased with care as if it had never been spoken. Rumors traveled faster than trams. In cafes and hallways, they moved like breath in winter, visible for a moment, then gone. Love letters, people said. Notes written in a hand that was unmistakable, folded small enough to hide in a glove. Coded phrases that looked harmless until you knew what they meant. And always the same detail that made the story itch. The sickness that arrived at exactly the right time, in exactly the right place, to end the wrong conversation. The translator listened, told himself it was gossip, then watched men fall silent mid-sentence whenever a plain coat entered the room. That week, a scrap of paper found its way into his pocket as if it had been planted there by accident. It was not a letter, only a copied fragment, the kind a typist might jot down before the original vanished into a drawer. The handwriting was quick. The ink faded, but one line stood out, a private form of address, tender and impatient, followed by a promise that sounded too human to be invented. The translator read it twice, then a third time, feeling the absurd fear of holding contraband that weighed less than a feather. He compared the fragment to what the newspapers printed about the leader's final years, about devotion, about tireless work, about purity of purpose, and the two stories refused to meet. The public narrative was a polished icon, all sharp angles and spotless marble. The fragment was warm, breathing, flawed. It spoke of meetings postponed, of longing disguised as necessity, of an absence that ached. If it was forged by someone who understood the rhythm of the man's sentences. If it was real, then the spotless life was a stage set, and someone had been sweeping footprints from the floor. That evening, he walked home through streets that smelled faintly of coal and damp wool, and he realized the smoke from Krupskaya's stove had not stayed in that apartment. It had seeped outward, clinging to the city like a second fog, settling into paper and cloth and memory. In a courtyard, two boys argued over a portrait of Lenin pasted to a wall, one insisting the eyes looked kind, the other insisting they looked angry. The translator kept moving, the fragment burning against his palm through the lining of his coat, and a single thought followed him like steps behind steps. If the truth was harmless, why did everyone behave as if it could explode? He began to ask in the only way a young man could in that city, carefully, sideways, with jokes that could be denied. At the press canteen, he mentioned the Frenchwoman as if repeating a foreign mispronunciation, and forks paused for half a heartbeat before clinking again. An older editor muttered that a wife was a fortress and nothing more should be said, then changed the subject to bread deliveries. Later, in a cramped hallway smelling of wet felt, a woman who once brought medicines to the household whispered that there were 3 names you learned to keep separate, because when they touched, people lost their positions. Krupskaya was spoken of like weather, constant, necessary, endured. To party loyalists, she was the saint who stayed, the comrade who never asked for herself, the face beside the leaders that proved virtue could be organized. To those who had seen her up close, she was something sharper, patient, proud, and bruised in a place no portrait could show. Mention her in the wrong tone and the room would stiffen as if you had insulted the revolution itself. Yet even the admirers avoided one detail: the way she sometimes fell silent mid-conversation, eyes fixed on a point beyond the wall, listening to something the rest of them were not allowed to hear. Inessa Armand, by contrast, entered stories like a lamp brought into a dark room, warmth first, then the uncomfortable visibility of everything. French, people said, even when she spoke Russian like a native, as if foreignness made the danger easier to explain. Some called her a seductress with revolutionary slogans in her perfume. Others called her the only person who could make him laugh without looking over their shoulder. A former courier described late nights when a visitor would arrive long after curfew, steps light on the stairs, and the household would suddenly rearrange itself around that presence. When the translator asked for certainty, he received only shrugs and a phrase repeated like a prayer. She was real, and that was the problem. The witnesses never agreed on dates, and that inconsistency felt deliberate, like mismatched footprints leading away from a door. One friend of the family insisted there had been sudden trips, quiet departures announced as rest, treatment, work, then hours of frantic activity to explain why the car had left at dawn. A doctor's assistant remembered an unexplained illness in the household that no one wrote down, as if sickness itself could be classified. Another swore that after Armand's death, the rooms changed. Curtains drawn tighter, conversations shorter, laughter treated like a political mistake. The translator kept thinking of the fragment in his pocket, the tenderness of the line, and how tenderness could be considered evidence. Elizabetta arrived last, and only as a shadow that moved at the edge of other people's memories. The name surfaced in side corridors, at the end of a story, in a nurse's stumble, in the pause before someone decided to lie. Elizabetta, an elderly neighbor said, then immediately corrected herself, insisting she meant a relative, a secretary, someone unimportant, as if the syllables had burned her tongue. A typist claimed she once filed an envelope with that name in the corner, then was told the file never existed. The translator tried to picture her and found he could not. She was less a person than a door left ajar, letting in cold air that made everyone pretend not to feel it. By the time he understood what he was touching, it was too late to put it down. This was not romantic gossip whispered for amusement. It was a fault line running beneath the marble pedestal they were already building, a crack that could widen if anyone pried at it. 3 women meant 3 versions of the leader, and 3 versions meant the public might choose the wrong one. One evening, a correspondent he trusted leaned close and murmured almost kindly that the state did not fear love. It feared what love could reveal about loyalty. Walking home, the translator smelled smoke again, faint but persistent, and wondered whose hands had struck the match that first made it necessary. Krupskaya returned to work as if grief were a task assigned at dawn. In public, she sat straight-backed beneath portraits and red cloth, taking notes in a small, neat hand, correcting careless phrasing, approving condolence telegrams with the same calm she once used to schedule meetings. People mistook that calm for emptiness. They didn't see the way she carried the revolution like a vow that couldn't be broken without losing her name. Each morning she chose it again, not with pride, but with the hard discipline of someone stepping onto thin ice and refusing to look down. In private, the apartment shrank around her. The stove that had eaten the letters looked ordinary now, dull iron, soot at the seams, but she watched it as if it might suddenly speak. She boiled water and poured tea and held the cup too tightly, waiting for her hands to stop trembling. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did not. On the table lay a stack of official condolences, thick paper, heavy ink, words that promised immortality. Beneath them, barely visible, a darker circle where ash water had dried, like a stain that would not accept cleaning. The translator was sent once with a packet for her office, a harmless delivery dressed as duty. He expected a symbol. He found a woman whose face looked carefully assembled from fatigue. She thanked him without warmth or cruelty, and for a moment her gaze slipped past him to the hallway, as if counting the distance to the stairwell. When he mentioned a foreign correspondent's question, only that there had been questions, her eyelids lowered, not in surprise, but in calculation. "There are questions," she repeated, tasting the word. The cup in her hand chimed softly against its saucer, a sound too small to matter and somehow impossible to ignore. Later, at a gathering of comrades, someone said Armand's name the way one might step on a loose floorboard, hoping it would not creak. Conversation stuttered. Krupskaya smiled, polite, practiced, and waited a beat too long before responding, as though she had to decide which Krupskaya should speak. "Inessa was a dedicated revolutionary," she said at last, voice even, the sentence clean enough to print. Then she added nothing. The silence after it did the rest of the talking, and the men in the room nodded too quickly, grateful for the exit she had offered them. Forgiveness, people told themselves, made her noble. But nobility was not what kept her standing. Fear did. Not fear of loneliness, not fear of humiliation, but fear of being pushed outside the story she had helped write. The cause could not afford scandal, and she could not afford to become a footnote, the discarded wife of a man turned into stone. She had learned over years that love in their world was never private property. It was a resource, measured, controlled, and, when necessary, confiscated. She had endured his absences, his secrecy, his sudden tenderness followed by sudden cold, because the alternative was chaos. At night, she replayed small moments that no one else would ever admit existed. A door closing softly after midnight. A pair of gloves on a chair that did not belong to her. The faint scent of foreign soap clinging to the air for an hour and then vanishing. She told herself she had chosen the larger truth, that history demanded sacrifices and she had simply paid what was required. Yet the bargain felt less like devotion with time, more like a contract signed in invisible ink, binding, unprovable, and enforced by people who never raised their voices. When the stove cooled, she still smelled smoke, and she understood with a clarity that made her throat tighten. Even the ashes were being watched. Long before the funeral smoke, before the city learned to speak his name like a prayer, there was a woman who walked into their cramped rooms and changed the temperature. Inessa Armand did not arrive with noise. She arrived with that faint Parisian music in her accent, heard even when she spoke Russian cleanly, and with a steadiness that made men who had survived prisons suddenly lower their voices. She dressed plainly, almost severely, yet everything about her suggested choice rather than poverty. When she listened, she did not merely agree, she measured, as if deciding whether you were real. The translator heard about her first the way Moscow always delivered dangerous truths, through contradictions. One comrade swore she was only a comrade, a capable organizer, nothing more. Another insisted she was the only person who could tell him no without punishment following. A former driver remembered waiting outside a building while she went in, then seeing her leave with papers held to her chest like a secret. She carried herself like she had already won, he said, then looked around as if the sentence had weight. In these memories, she was never incidental. She was a match struck in a room full of gas. Those who had been close to the household described a shift that could not be explained by politics alone. In private, he became oddly lighter, shorter temper, yes, but also sudden warmth, a rare softness in the corners of his voice. In public, the opposite. Sharper speeches, colder decisions, the kind of severity that made even loyal comrades flinch. It was as if he feared anyone might notice the change and decided to punish them preemptively for seeing it. The circle around him felt the new gravity and adjusted their orbits, pretending the center had not moved, while feeling it move all the same. In one story, the translator heard twice, from two different mouths that did not know each other. There was an overheard moment in a corridor where the walls were thin and everyone acted as if they were thick. Her voice, low and controlled. "Do you want me to lie?" A pause long enough to hold a whole life. Then his answer, clipped, intimate in its caution. "No," he answers. "Only to be careful." The witnesses remembered that sentence the way people remember a gunshot, because it makes everything before it rearrange itself into warning. Careful, in their world, didn't mean discreet romance. It meant survival. It meant choosing which truths could exist and which had to be folded into silence. Armand understood this better than most because she had lived among different languages, different police, different kinds of fear. She knew how the state listened, how it made ordinary words dangerous by deciding they were. That was what made their intimacy so perilous. Not only desire, but a shared hunger for certainty, for a place where the world stopped shifting and became, for a moment, solid underfoot. And yet certainty was the one thing the revolution could not afford between two people. It created loyalties the party could not schedule. It produced letters that could be read out of context, glances that could be misinterpreted on purpose, expenses that required explanations. The translator began to understand why the fragments in his pocket felt radioactive. If Armand had been merely an affair, the story would have died as gossip. But if she had been a private equal, someone who could influence mood, decisions, timing, then her existence was a political fact, and political facts demanded control. By the time her name started to disappear from briefings, it had already become too present in memory. People remembered late-night footsteps and doors that closed without a click, as if even metal had learned not to announce itself. They remembered meetings rescheduled for reasons no one wrote down, and sudden trips explained with a vagueness that sounded rehearsed. The translator walked past a kiosk selling portraits and felt the absurdity of it. A face turned into an icon, while the life behind the face was being trimmed like a censored article. Somewhere, someone had decided the match must be blamed for the fire, and that the safest proof was smoke. In the official telling, her end was simple: a tired body, an unfortunate illness, a revolutionary worn down by roads and duty. The communiqué spoke in soft, responsible language, the kind that turns a death into a lesson. People repeated it because repetition felt safe. Yet even in Moscow, where everyone learned to swallow questions, the story tasted too clean. Misfortune is usually messy. This one had been pressed flat, ironed into a tidy rectangle that fit neatly into a file. Those who had seen her not long before described a woman still sharp with energy, still making decisions that irritated the timid. Then suddenly, she was gone, so quickly that the speed itself became a detail people could not stop touching in their minds. One day she was writing, traveling, arguing. The next, they said, she was fading, and no one could agree on when the fading truly began. Some insisted she fell ill on the road, others in a house where the curtains stayed drawn. A friend who used to speak freely grew cautious overnight, answering questions with a smile that felt like a padlock. The translator hunted for ordinary facts, the kind you could repeat without sounding like a conspirator. Dates, names, who was present, who signed what. Each time he thought he had something solid, it shifted. In one account, a doctor's name was clear and confident, attached to the diagnosis like a seal. In another retelling, the same doctor became a medical worker, then a specialist, then nothing at all, as if a person could be edited out of the world by changing a noun. When the translator asked a clerk to check a register, the clerk's eyes flicked to the doorway before he answered, and his voice dropped into that careful tone Muscovites used when walls might have ears. At a smoky table behind the press canteen, an aging nurse finally offered a detail that did not belong in the official tragedy. Her papers, she said, staring at the chipped glass in her hand, were secured for safekeeping. She spoke the phrase the way people repeat something memorized under pressure, exact syllables, no embellishment. Secured. Not collected, not kept, not preserved, secured, like a door being bolted from the outside. The translator felt a chill at the precision of it, at how the word turned a personal life into a state object with a lock and a key. He tried to imagine what those papers contained and found that the mind always went to the same place. Letters, drafts, names written in the margins, sums of money noted as casually as weather. Things that could prove not only love, but influence, not only tenderness, but timing. The circle around the leader had always moved like a machine, and Armand had been one of the few human sounds inside it. If she had left behind pages that showed the machine hesitating, changing direction, softening, then the papers were not sentimental. They were dangerous in the most practical way. In the weeks that followed, the silence around her grew heavier, not lighter, as if time was being used to bury rather than to heal. The translator noticed how people corrected themselves mid-sentence, how a name could vanish from a conversation like breath sucked back into the lungs. A correspondent asked whether she had been seen at the very end, and the translator realized no one could answer without choosing a version that would anger someone powerful. He walked home through damp snow and understood, with a clarity that made his stomach tighten, that Armand's death was not the end of the story. It was the moment the story was taken away. They did not come in the night with boots and oaths, not this time. They came in daylight, with hats held politely in their hands and a tone that suggested sympathy. Assistance, they called it, the way you might offer to carry a heavy suitcase for a widow. In offices and apartments, men with mild faces produced forms already filled out, then waited with patient pens. When someone hesitated, they smiled as if understanding the strain of grief. The translator learned to fear that softness more than shouting, because it left no bruise you could point to, only the feeling of having agreed to something while you were still reading the first line. The first things to disappear were not people, but objects. A box here, a folder there, lifted with the careful hands of librarians. Labels appeared: inventory, transfer, consolidation. And the words looked harmless until you noticed how quickly they spread. A clerk shrugged and said records were being reclassified, as if it were no more dramatic than moving a chair. The translator watched a stack of documents slide across a desk into a satchel and realized no one was stealing. Theft implied illegality. This was authority rearranging the world. The only sound was paper whispering against paper, like a secret being taught to walk. Those who had been closest to the household were not dragged away in chains. Some received new postings in distant towns, announced as promotions that came too suddenly to refuse. Others simply stopped appearing in familiar places, their chairs occupied by strangers who asked fewer questions. A woman who once served tea at meetings began using different entrances and different routes home, as if she had learned the geography of fear by heart. The translator noticed how quickly forgetting became a public virtue. People corrected their own memories in conversation, smoothing rough edges before anyone else could. The city did not lose its witnesses. It watched them become careful. One afternoon, a former courier agreed to speak, but only while walking, only while keeping pace with the wind along the river. He was a thin man with red hands and eyes that darted toward every doorway. "Letters," he said, as if naming a disease. Not one letter, letters, plural, enough to require habits and procedures. Some never reached their recipient, he hinted, because someone had begun treating envelopes like explosives. They told us it was a security matter, he murmured. A private page could be a state threat. The translator asked who gave the order. The courier's mouth tightened. No one gives an order, he said. It arrives. The politeness had its own choreography. Visits were scheduled, not forced. Tea was offered, declined, then accepted out of courtesy. Questions were asked in a voice that sounded almost apologetic. Do you recall where she kept her papers? Would you be so kind as to sign here? A man would nod thoughtfully at an answer, then write something different. The translator began to notice how language itself was being repurposed. Safekeeping meant removal. Assistance meant control. Reclassification meant disappearance. Even grief was useful because the mourning made everyone's eyes drop to the floor at the right moments. That evening, he returned to his room and took out the copied fragment he had been hiding, turning it under the lamp as if light might reveal fingerprints. It suddenly looked less like a relic and more like bait, something small enough to circulate, dangerous enough to justify a net. He understood then why the conspiracy felt worse than the stories of raids. It offered the illusion of consent. It turned people into collaborators in their own silence, one signature at a time. Outside, Moscow kept building its monument, stone rising clean and bright. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of smoke, and the ashes still did not match. Money was the first thing in Moscow that refused to mourn properly. Posters could blacken, bands could play slower, voices could soften on command, but the ruble kept its indifferent arithmetic, slipping through fingers and leaving stains no speech could cover. The translator began to notice it in small, unpatriotic details. A car that appeared on a street where petrol was rationed, an apartment quietly reassigned, a train compartment reserved when veterans stood in the corridor. Love letters could be burned, names could be erased, but payments had to pass through hands, and hands remembered weight. He met the accountant by accident, or by the kind of accident that later feels staged. The man sat alone at a side table in a dim canteen near the administrative offices, nursing a glass of vodka as if it were medicine and punishment in the same swallow. His suit looked decent but tired, the cuffs shiny with wear, the collar too tight. He spoke with the brittle cheer of someone who had spent years turning life into columns. You translate for foreigners, he said, not quite a question. Then, after a pause that seemed to test the air, he added, Foreigners ask the wrong questions. They should ask about receipts. At first, the translator tried to laugh it off, but the accountant leaned closer and the smell of vodka sharpened into something like courage. There were stipends, he said, small enough to hide, steady enough to matter. Travel expenses that never appeared under a person's name, only under projects with noble titles. Apartments arranged without signatures. Keys delivered by men who did not introduce themselves. Medical assistance, he murmured, rolling the phrase as if tasting its false sweetness. Approved without questions. The translator asked, whose assistance? The accountant's eyes flicked to the doorway. Does it matter? He said softly. It came from the same pocket that tells workers to tighten their belts. The sums were never written in a way you could point to in court or in history. They were implied, disguised as routine operations, disguised so well that only someone who lived among the numbers would notice the pattern, regular as a pulse, stubborn as a habit. The accountant described a ledger line that looked like transport costs, but repeated with the same timing as a woman's letters arriving and leaving. Another line appeared whenever a certain name was spoken to loudly, then vanished when the name became dangerous. "You think secrecy is silence," he said, his voice turning suddenly bitter. "Secrecy is paperwork done correctly." He regretted speaking almost as soon as the words left him. The bravado drained, leaving him pale, and he drank again as if to wash the confession back down. "Forget it," he muttered, staring into the glass. But the translator could not forget the logic of it. If the revolution demanded sacrifice from everyone, why were exceptions quietly purchased? Why did someone always find money for comfort when comfort was supposed to be a bourgeois disease? It didn't feel like romance anymore. It felt like infrastructure. A hidden corridor built alongside the official one, financed and maintained so that certain doors could open without creaking. Walking home, the translator saw the city with altered eyes, as if a layer of paint had cracked. A woman in a worn shawl argued with a baker over a few kopecks, while somewhere else, a medical bill could be paid without a single stamp of scrutiny. He imagined the missing letters traveling not by chance, but by budget. Routes funded, couriers assigned, absences made possible with a line item no one was allowed to question. Smoke could be explained away as grief, but money was a different kind of ash. It settled into ledgers, into pockets, into the quiet understanding that some truths were expensive and therefore guarded. The accountant's confession left the translator with a new kind of hunger. If money could be disguised, then so could a person. He began listening for what people did not mean to say, the accidental syllables that slipped out when fatigue loosened the tongue. In a hallway outside the canteen, an old comrade chuckled at a joke and then, without looking up, muttered a name as if it were a stain. Elizabetta. The word hung there for a moment, small and ordinary, and then the man's face changed. "I said nothing," he corrected himself too quickly, and the corridor suddenly felt narrower. Elizabetta did not live in memoirs or speeches. She lived in side remarks and half-sentences, in the spaces where official language failed to cover the human. A nurse who had once volunteered for household duties spoke of a visitor in the early hours. Then, as if scolded by her own memory, she amended it to a relative, then to no one at all. A neighbor remembered a woman leaving at dawn, scarf pulled too low, head turned away from the stairwell lamp, moving like someone who knew which boards would creak. When the translator asked what her face looked like, the neighbor frowned as though searching a fog. "I only remember the hurry," she said, "and that she didn't want to be seen." The name surfaced in the most irritating way, not as a fact, but as a pattern. It appeared when people spoke of sudden trips, of medicines delivered without signatures, of a door opened quietly and closed even more quietly. It never came with a surname, never with a date that could be pinned down, never with a photograph to freeze it into certainty. That was what made it dangerous. Armand could be denied, even erased, because she had been known. Denial had something to push against. Elizabetta was mist. You could shape mist into any outline you wished, then swear you had seen it walking. A foreign correspondent, frustrated by evasions, told the translator over tea that Moscow was full of decoys. "They throw you a story, so you chase it," he said, tapping ash into a saucer, "while the real thing slips past." The translator wanted to dismiss it as Western melodrama, but the thought would not leave him. What if Elizabetta was not a secret at all, but a screen, an invented third point meant to muddy the water, to make every whisper sound unreliable? Or what if she was the real secret, kept out of sight even from Armand, a private channel no one dared name openly? He tried to verify her the way a careful mind verifies anything, through mundane traces, housing registers, travel permissions, clinic logs. Each inquiry met the same gentle wall. Clerks smiled and shrugged, pointing to empty shelves or to rules that had apparently existed forever. Once, a young woman at a counter lowered her voice and said, almost kindly, "You are looking for a person without paper." Then she straightened, glanced past him, and added in a louder tone, "There is no such entry." The translator turned and saw a man in a plain coat studying a notice board as if it contained fascinating poetry. That night, a folded slip of paper appeared under his door. No signature, no seal. Just a name written in pencil and an address that looked like it belonged to an ordinary building. Elizabetta. The pencil marks were light, almost hesitant, as if whoever wrote them feared leaving too much pressure on the world. The translator sat on his bed, listening to the building settle and groan, and understood the trap in the offer. If he went, he might find nothing and be made to look foolish. If he did not go, he would never know whether he had refused a truth or avoided becoming the next person politely persuaded to forget. The slip with Elizabetta's name did not lead to a door that opened cleanly. It led to years that folded over themselves, wariness, work, silence performed as instinct. The translator learned what Moscow teaches best: how to live with unanswered questions without letting them show on your face. He kept his copied fragment hidden through relocations and changing slogans, through seasons when people disappeared without farewell and seasons when they returned pretending nothing had happened. By the time the old world began to loosen in the 1990s, his hair had gone thin, but the paper in his pocket was still sharp enough to cut. The city changed its skin and kept its bones. Kiosks sold foreign cigarettes beside cheap books. Men in worn coats hawked medals, icons, and documents on folding tables near metro entrances, as if the past had become a market. In that unsettled air, the announcement arrived with a strange casualness. Lenin's letters to Inessa Armand were being published at last. The translator bought a copy from a stall where the vendor handled the pages with greasy fingers and a grin. "Everything is open now," the man said too loudly, as if daring someone to disagree. The book smelled of fresh glue and old scandal. The letters were there, some tender, some abrupt, some aching with a need that did not fit the granite image. Readers argued immediately in newspapers and kitchens. Was it love, obsession, guilt, or simply a lonely man clinging to the one person who spoke to him without trembling? Yet the translator noticed the gaps before he noticed the passion. Ellipses appeared like bandages. Dates skipped. Transitions felt amputated. Editorial notes insisted on completeness in the same tone that once insisted Armand did not exist. He turned pages with the careful slowness of someone diffusing a device. And then it happened. A phrase that made his throat tighten because he had seen it before, not in print, but in that copied fragment he had hidden for decades. The rhythm matched, the private form of address, the impatient tenderness that could not be mistaken for propaganda. For a moment, the room around him vanished, replaced by the memory of smoke, the smell of coal-wet Moscow, and a young man realizing that paper could be treated like a weapon. What had surfaced now was not the whole truth. It was only what had survived the fire and the hands that fed it. The translator began comparing the published text to his fragment the way an accountant compares ledgers. The omissions were not random. They clustered around moments that hinted at logistics, meetings postponed, routes rearranged, health mentioned with unusual urgency. Where the letters grew too specific, the page grew too smooth. It felt less like transparency than like a controlled leak, calibrated for an era when the old punishments had lost their teeth. No one could be sent away for reading now. No one could be reassigned for asking. The danger had shifted from prisons to interpretation, from fear to ridicule. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was guiding what the public was allowed to learn. Why release these letters after so many years, and why in this form, complete enough to satisfy curiosity, incomplete enough to protect the mechanism behind the myth? He closed the book and stared at the cheap cover, thinking of Krupskaya's stove and the word secured, thinking of money lines disguised as routine, thinking of Elizabetta's penciled name. The state had changed its flags, but secrecy had simply changed its manners. And as the translator tucked the book under his arm, he understood the cruelest possibility. The letters were not a confession. They were a message, proof that someone, somewhere, still controlled the ashes. The book sat on the translator's table like a small legal miracle, and yet it made him think of locks. He began to read Lenin backward, not as a statue, but as a man who had held power for 7 years and still could not command his own pulse. The public image was iron. Speeches, decrees, the stern gaze reproduced until it became a national mirror. But between the printed lines, another figure moved, restless, exacting, sometimes tender, sometimes suddenly cruel, as if tenderness itself frightened him. The contradictions did not weaken the myth. They explained why someone had worked so hard to protect it. People who had been near Lenin rarely described grand scenes. They remembered the small humiliations of proximity. A pencil snapped because the lead would not sharpen. A teacup pushed away because the tea was too hot. A report dismissed because one word sounded soft. After Armand's death, one associate recalled, Lenin's irritation became strangely indiscriminate, landing on trivialities with the force of policy. Another spoke of him pacing in a room while everyone pretended not to hear. "He could be kind," the man said, then lowered his voice. But kindness cost him. He paid for it by becoming harsher later. The translator noticed how these recollections always came with a second layer, an instinctive self-censorship that survived the collapse of the old fear. Men would begin a sentence, then exchange a glance with the ceiling as if the plaster might still report them. He blamed himself, someone would say, then stop, uncertain whether blame was permitted. In public, Lenin had insisted history was made by forces, by classes, by inevitability. In private, the witnesses implied, he behaved like a person who had lost a single, irreplaceable voice. And that was the scandal no monument could absorb. The architect of a new world bending under the oldest force in it. There were also the moments of eerie calm, the kind that arrive not from healing, but from decision. A secretary described it as a switch being thrown. After days of snapping and sleeplessness, Lenin became quieter, almost gentle, his instructions suddenly precise and final. He stopped asking certain questions. He stopped waiting for certain replies. It was as if something had been settled for him elsewhere, off stage. The translator remembered the courier's words, "An order does not get given, it arrives," and wondered whether grief had been managed like correspondence, intercepted and redirected until it no longer reached its rightful place. In the 1990s, readers argued about the letter's tone, but the translator kept returning to their omissions. The published tenderness made sense. It was safe now, even profitable. What felt dangerous were the missing bridges between sentences, the absent logistics, the clipped endings where a human confession might have touched a bureaucratic trail. Love could be forgiven in retrospect, even romanticized. Influence could not. If Armand's absence had shifted his mood and his mood had shifted decisions, then private weakness became a political mechanism, one that had to be concealed, not to save his reputation, but to preserve the fantasy of infallible discipline. The translator closed the book and stared at the window where the city's lights blurred in damp air. He thought of Krupskaya burning paper with the calm of someone signing her name to a sacrifice, and of money lines disguised as routine, and of Elizabetta's penciled name that refused to become a person. Lenin, he realized, had been surrounded by devotion and by surveillance in equal measure, and sometimes they were the same thing. In the end, the conspiracy was not that he loved, or that he strayed, or that he suffered. It was that a system built to control millions had been forced to control one man's heart, and it did so with quiet hands. In the last months of the 1990s, when everything old was being sold, borrowed, or confessed, the translator found the one document no editor wanted to print. It was not a love letter. It was an inventory sheet, thin, official, stamped so many times it looked bruised, listing boxes moved for safekeeping after Armand's death. Next to dates and banal descriptions sat a single handwritten word, repeated like a quiet signature. Elizabetta. Not a surname, not a patronymic. A marker, a corridor name. He read it twice and felt the same cold certainty he had felt decades earlier. This had never been only about romance. He tracked the sheet to a retired clerk who lived in a concrete block where the elevator stank of cabbage and wet wool. The man opened the door cautiously as if expecting someone else, then relaxed when he saw only an aging stranger with careful eyes. Over weak tea, he said he remembered those boxes because everyone remembered them. They arrived with polite men and blank forms, and they left behind a silence that spread through the office like smoke. Elizabetta? The translator asked. The clerk gave a tired smile. Not a woman, he said almost gently. A designation. A drawer that does not exist. You put things there when you want them to live and not live at the same time. Suddenly, the old rumors rearranged themselves into something sharper. The midnight visits, the reassigned witnesses, the money that appeared without signatures, the letters that never arrived. They had needed a name you could whisper without proving, a shadow that could absorb blame, a decoy that made every question sound like gossip. Elizabetta was the perfect invention because she was also a system, a code that turned private paper into state property, a method for intercepting grief and rerouting it into mythology. The translator heard the courier's voice again. An order arrives, and understood what that order had been. Remove the human factor from the leader's story before the human factor removed the leader. The letters published in the 1990s now felt less like liberation and more like choreography. Enough tenderness to soften the stone, not enough detail to expose the machinery. The gaps were not accidents. They were doorways bricked up from the inside. And Krupskaya, patient, rigid, wounded, fit into the mechanism like a key that hated its own lock. She had burned paper so the revolution could remain a religion, and she had paid the price by carrying the smell of smoke for the rest of her life. Forgiveness, he realized, had not been a virtue. It had been a condition. He went home and took out his copied Fragment, the small contraband line that had survived every relocation and every new slogan. He placed it beside the published letters and the inventory sheet, 3 pieces of the same puzzle that had been scattered across 70 years. For the first time, the shape was visible. A man powerful enough to redraw borders, yet vulnerable enough to be managed. A woman real enough to change his weather, then erased. A wife who stayed because leaving would have shattered the myth. And a polite security apparatus that treated longing as a state threat. The conspiracy did not end with a gunshot. It ended with a stove, a stamp, and a word that pretended to be a person. The translator did not try to drag Lenin off his pedestal. He simply refused to let the pedestal pretend it had no scaffolding. He wrote his account in plain language, without melodrama, and sent it where it could not be quietly reclassified again, into public hands, into foreign print, into the untidy memory of ordinary readers. Some called him a cynic, some called him brave, but he knew he was only doing what the ashes had demanded from the beginning, matching the smoke to its source, even if the fire had been polite. If this made you want to dig deeper into the sealed corners of that era, watch the other videos on the channel. Then write your opinion in the comments about who you believe Elizabetta really was. And finally, like the video if you felt the truth hiding between the lines.